Thank you all for inviting me. Thank you, Dean Anderson, and Ebony. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I'll start, what I wanted to start out with, by way of background into the title of my presentation, is that when I founded the Center for Urban Education, everyone was talking about diversity in education, and we were all celebrating diversity. And I had moved to the University of Southern California, which is in downtown Los Angeles, and I was puzzled by diversity because most of the institutions of higher education in California, except of course the most elite, had no diversity issues. They were quite diverse already. Their issues were more about the racial equity in outcomes, that the students who were making diversity possible were not necessarily achieving equitable outcomes. So that's one of the impetus for founding the Center for Urban Education. But the second impetus was that I sort of had an intellectual crisis. And that intellectual crisis was that here I was a full professor, and I asked myself, what good does my work do? Because it's primarily read by my colleagues. And then another part of my intellectual crisis was that for 10 years before I went to get my doctorate, I had been involved in community organizing in New Jersey. And so I had to say, I have been seduced by the academy, and now I'm content just, doing research and just writing for a small group. How could that be? So my intellectual crisis led me to founding Center for Urban Education, but the way that we do research is very different from typical research, in that going back to those community organizing roots, I sort of adopted the action research methods to work in collaboration with colleges to bring about their own change. And it was that way that we have developed all kinds of tools to do that. So just to give you, we work in California with community colleges primarily, but also with some of the private colleges and some of the Cal States. We work in Colorado with their community college system, and we also work in Oklahoma. And we have worked in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in the latter part of the presentation. But first, I want to talk about why I titled the presentation Reclaiming Racial Justice Inequity. So in 2000, when I started the center and I spoke about, you can hear me okay, right? When I started the center and I said that our focus, our mission would be on racial equity, I was told by many, including some of the foundations that were supporting me, not to lead with racial equity. They felt that that was a big mistake, and many associated the term equity and racial equity in particular with activism and advocacy and divisiveness. And so I always say now that I am really happy that I stuck to my original agenda, because now everyone has caught up to me. And so now in 2019, everyone is talking about equity. And so you see equity in maybe in strategic plans. Equity has become very prominent in the agendas of philanthropic organizations. You will see the term used in the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Education, and so on. So when I was invited by Change Magazine to write an essay for their 50th anniversary, I decided to write this article on reclaiming racial justice inequity. And I'm using the reclaiming because, as you may remember, Maxine Waters, when she said reclaiming my time, when I think it was Munching, was trying to silence her when she was questioning him about the Trump's relationship with Russia. So that's why I'm saying reclaiming my time. And what I wanted to do in this article was not only reclaiming, I wanted to reclaim equity from the trend towards, in some ways, whitewashing it. And I was also concerned that the people who were using the term racial equity were not really, they had no understanding of the critical roots and dimensions of racial equity. I said on my way here in the car when I was with your associate dean, and I said to him, I think I may have said something about the 60s. And so for me, that's my reference point. I'm old. I lived through the 1968, and, which is the birth of, in many ways, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, SNCC, and their project was not about diversity. It was about equity. So what do I mean by the racial justice meaning of equity? So one meaning is that equity is a means of corrective justice. And I'm drawing here from the work of Lionel McPherson. And is corrective justice for the debt that is owed to the descendants of enslaved people, and which is what Gloria Ladson Billings has written about. A second meaning of equity is that equity is an anti-racist project, essentially to confront overt and covert racism that's embedded in institutional practices, structures, and policies. And I'm drawing there from Michael Pollack. She wrote a book, Color Mute. And then the last thing is equity as a critical lens to magnify whiteness and make it visible to higher education leaders, policymakers, philanthropists, and intermediaries. Whiteness is something that we don't talk about very much. So in thinking about this, so one of the things that happens is that many of the reforms in higher education right now, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the reforms. There is a big initiative for graduation, improving graduation. There is pathways for community colleges. There is predictive analytics to channel students into the majors where supposedly they will do better. There is intrusive advising. And many of these initiatives are coming from outside of higher education through intermediary organizations. But one of the interesting things is that when these initiatives are, portrayed, they're often portrayed with illustrations like this one, where what you see here is education paves the way for young people to succeed, but too few today are completing a college degree. But so race is not mentioned there, right? There's not. But you look at the illustration that captures that, and obviously we're seeing Black students. So it's kind of like it's racializing, but without naming race. And here's another one. The too few U.S. students are ready for college when they arrive, and more than 40% drop out before they finish. And again, what you see is this illustration, again, no naming of race, nor suggesting that racism might have something to do with it. So in seeing all of this, when I had to give a lecture at ARA for the social justice in education, I decided to make the topic of my lecture a review of these reforms and looking at them from a critical race perspective. So what I did was I looked at the documents of these reforms, and I asked these questions. Is race visible in the document, and in what ways is it visible? Does the depiction of the problem and solutions reflect an understanding of the underlying causes that account for racial inequality? And will the recommended reforms build the capacity of practitioners to produce racial justice in educational outcomes? And in order to do that, what I did, and I'm going to show you, I focused there is the Gates Foundation, Lumina Foundation, a whole bunch of other organizations developed a document that's titled Student Success Strategy, which is about developmental education. Now, developmental education is remedial education, and which has become in many ways a warehouse for in California, particularly for Latino students. I mean, 60, 70% of the students who go to community college are being put into those courses. And the same thing happens with Black students. So I decided to look at that document. And the other document that I decided to look at is something called the Transfer Playbook, which was being distributed widely. And I decided to look at that one because transfer is a major equity issue, at least for us in California, where the master plan purposely, diverted the growing Latino population and Black students into the community colleges as a way of preventing, in many ways, the massification of the University of California system. So transfer is very important. So here's what I found when I looked at, this is the transfer playbook, and so, the only mentions were diversity and diverse twice. Like, this is a document of 20 pages long, and I think that Latino was once, and I think it was in the title of something. So, so here is this document that is laying out principles for how to reform developmental education and student success, and there is absolutely no mention of minoritized students, nothing. And I will I'll talk about why I think that is. So here is a summary of what we found in both documents. Race is invisible. Race-free terms are used as substitutes for racial identity. Transfer students are portrayed as a natural source of diversity supply for four-year colleges, which is a very market-oriented way of thinking about transfer students. And a lot of faith is placed on structural and procedural fixes. Most of these reforms are structural. It's about creating new structures or changing structures. They rarely ever deal with changing people, and in particular changing practitioners and leaders. And the preferred term is all students. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think you get the point, right? Yeah? Okay. So the question I asked is, why is race missing? One of the reasons why I think it's missing is because most of the people who are using the term equity do not understand its critical dimension. So one of the ways in which I think about equity is having two dimensions. One is accountability to students, but I'm not going to talk about that. And the other one is a critical dimension. And that critical dimension is being able to, if you're using the term, is being able to recognize that institutionalized racism is a feature of our colleges and universities, because they were, historically, they were founded by and for white. Even though we have become more diverse, the colleges themselves have not changed. So the person sitting on the frail man is saying, I am sitting on the back of a man. He's sinking under the burden. I would do anything to help him except stepping down from his back. And the reason why I am using this to explain the meaning of critical equity is that in many ways, we do the same thing with these reforms. I want, for instance, more racially minoritized faculty to be hired. I bet that you want that here at the University of Illinois. I will support more outreach, right, and other best practices. But I am not willing to accept that our values and preferences reproduce whiteness in hiring. And so nobody says that exactly, but that's essentially what we're doing. We are changing, we're tinkering around, but we're not really getting to the point that the hiring system, the procedures and the values that guide it is what makes it so difficult to diversify the faculty. And, I mentioned before that we work with lots of institutions, including privates. Well, and now I'm deviating. Cal Lutheran University, which is a private institution in California, the provost and the president decided that they were becoming a Hispanic serving institution, that they had to change their faculty. And they hired us for 1 year. And we worked with them, with the provost and 15 faculty members, to become the equity agents in hiring, in search committees. And what we did with them is we mapped out the entire faculty hiring system from the time you write the job announcement all the way to the interview, the questions, and the offer. And we just changed everything, which the job announcement now actually says Cal Lutheran is a Hispanic serving institution. Our students are, and they gave the statistics, we are looking for faculty members who have experience teaching students like the ones in our institutions, because California has an anti-affirmative action ban, so you can't be real direct. And then what we said was ask the applicants with their to write a letter in which they say what their experience is with culturally responsive pedagogy, and then we also changed the interview questions. And so what happened, when you change the artifacts of the practice, people's thinking also begins to change. And when their hirings in the last 3 years are totally different from anything they did in the previous, 10, 20 years. So they kind of embraced it. Anyway, so going back to this, we might say, I want more racially minoritized students to be successful in my course, and I offer them help, right? Faculty say a lot of this. But I cannot compromise on meritocratic standards that are objective and colorblind. So the point of critical equity is to be able to see that it's not enough to want to be salvationist. It's, you also need to think about how your salvationist practices themselves are reproducing perhaps the inequities or the failures that you're trying to solve. So here's my sort of summary of why race is missing. Well, one is because of universalistic thinking, which is we care about all students. Have you heard that? We care about that's code word for we're not going to talk about Black Lives Matter. The other is it's too risky. We're over racism. And a lot of times people think of racism as individual acts and don't understand how it is that the more dangerous is the one that's structural. So, and then if you look at the bullet point before the last one, closed academic networks are closed to critical race perspectives. And the point is that the people who are making decisions in this reform agenda is a very closed network of organizations that essentially are involved in everything. And they know each other, and they reproduce themselves. Michael Olivas, a legal scholar, many, many years ago, wrote an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education about how scholars, white scholars who are writing about civil rights and discrimination still cite other white scholars rather than citing the work of minoritized scholars. And so this is kind of similar. And the other one is not what we know how to do. This is always, I don't know how to do that, and I'm afraid that I'll make a mistake. So let me move on then. So that's part of my talk in terms of putting racial equity back, racial justice into equity. So what is it that I want, or what we want? And we want practitioners, leaders, to develop equity-minded competencies, and these are the competencies that so whenever I see the term equity-minded used, it really makes me upset, because it's not just a word. There are competencies associated with it that we at our center developed, and these competencies are that you have to be aware of your racial identity. You also have to be race conscious. You have to use disaggregated data to identify racialized patterns and outcomes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, because there are also dangers in that if you don't know how to facilitate it. You have to reflect on the racial consequences of taken for granted practices. And you have to exercise agency and actively self-monitor your practices to produce racial equity. And you have to view the institution as a racialized space. And I'm going to show you how we do this, because this is the work that we do through action research. So the conceptual way, the way that we think about change is actually from social, cultural, historical activity theory, so, which is learning. So, this theory has been applied to to young people, not children, right? Well, adults, in higher education, need to also learn racial equity, because they haven't been taught it, right? They haven't been, they haven't been taught in school how to be equity-minded. So I don't think you probably see this really well, but I'll tell you what's in it. Essentially, what we think about is that we are creating activity settings, and those activity settings have subjects, meaning faculty members, deans, chairs, presidents. And these subjects, in Colorado, the subjects are math faculty where we're working. And these subjects need tools, what we call artifacts, right, to learn to become equity-minded. They cannot become equity-minded by sitting in a session like this. They have to have tools that scaffold equity-mindedness for them, the competencies that I showed you. And the other thing is in this, so for us, those tools and artifacts are the most important thing to change. But you also need to change the rules. So often what happens in meetings, if I'm sitting in a meeting, I may be the only one who's thinking about these things at my school. And so it always falls upon me to raise the race question, right? And so by division of labor is teaching others to also assume that responsibility, so that they also see whether it's microaggressions being committed or something else. And the rules around our work are that we're talking about best practitioners, best equity-minded practitioners, not best practices. So we are not into the best practices movement. So the artifacts that we have created them all at the center are these kinds of tools. They're policy tools, data tools, and all of them are essentially guides or protocols that enable the subjects to look at their practices. So a lot of the work that takes place in higher education and in the institutions that we work with are in teams. And this actually comes from earlier work that I did with Anna Newman. But what I want to point to is when we tell our teams that every team has to have an equity anchor, at least one, preferably more. And that equity anchor is the person or the persons who bring up the issues that I mentioned earlier. They are the ones that understand critical race equity. And so what we have found in the reforms works, that faculty from racial ethnic programs like AfricanAmerican Studies, Chicano Studies, they are rarely ever included in the committees in this work, but they are the ones often who could be the equity anchors because they have the intellectual, theoretical, historical knowledge to be able to play that role. So, okay. So one of the equity-minded competencies is being race-conscious and aware of racial identity, right? So to illustrate this, we have a project with STEM faculty at Cal State LA. 10 faculty members who have a grant from HMMI, and they have asked us to work with them through a series of institutes. So the first institute was a couple of weeks ago, and we decided to make it about understanding their identity, right? That was the first thing. And this is important with STEM faculty because they are not likely to talk about this. Are you from STEM? So these individuals are very committed to this project, and the project that the grant that they got for is to address issues of equity. So this is many of you probably have seen this activity. Is an activity where you identify your, like I would say, I'm a woman, I'm Latina, I'm a professor, and so forth. And then you move to the center of the wheel, those identities that are the most salient for you. So this is what happened at this meeting. The first person to speak was an African-American male faculty, and he said, the racial identity that I identified as most salient is being black and being a man. And he said, it's not until individuals get through the stereotypes they have of African-American males that they may see other aspects of my identity that are important to me, such as spirituality, coming from a close-knit family, being middle class, and having parents and grandparents who attended college. So he named that. But the thing that happened in that there were white faculty members as well, and the purpose of this activity is for everybody to understand their racial identity and for them to maybe recognize I am white, and and white plays out in these ways. But they didn't. They actually named other things, and nobody. So this is what happens. So I knew what was going on, and I tried to, without saying, what about white, right? But to no avail. And so that tells me, as the person who's working with this, I have to do something else now for the white faculty members to come to see that. But it wasn't just them. There were also international faculty that didn't recognize that. So the point is that that we have to facilitate a way for white faculty to be able to see that that being white does structure perhaps the relationships, classrooms, and so forth differently. Okay, so, and here is, and this is from our Colorado project with math faculty. This is one of our researchers writing her notes. And this was after one of these activities where the faculty, she says the faculty member said, it was not until that moment, one of the activities, that it occurred to her that white privilege exists in the math classroom. So the purpose of these activities is to raise awareness, but also to change practices. So I mentioned data, disaggregated data, but the kind of disaggregated data that we use is at the classroom level, at the course level. And so this is data from the math faculty in Colorado. This is the same course taught by 4 different instructors. And what we do is we disaggregate their success rates by race and ethnicity so that they can see that there are different outcomes. And you can see, instructor number 1, for instance, the color codes are either below or above the average. So instructor number 1 is doing not well with anyone, right? Instructor 2 is doing quite well with Black students, not so well with white students, and not so well with Latinx students, and so on. So the purpose of using data like this, and our math faculty love it, is for them to be able to say, okay, what's happening with the Black students or the Latinx students that they're not doing so well in my class, right? So we're using disaggregated data not for, I don't know what it's Kimberly Griffin says, gap gazing. So not for gap gazing, but for actually going back to one's practices. And the reason why they like this data is because it makes sense. It's close to their practice. So the other competency is reflecting on the racial consequences of taking for granted practices. So the syllabus is a taken for granted practice, right? There's always a syllabus for every course. But we don't tend to think of the syllabus as an artifact that mediates students' feelings about a class or their sense of the likelihood that they will succeed, or as an artifact of establishing a relationship between the instructor and the students. So we have created this syllabus review guide, which soon is going to go, so even though I criticize foundations, the Gates Foundation is actually supporting the development of some of these tools. And it's going to be interactive, and we will have a site for it. But what it is, this guide, is it enables teams of faculty to either review their own syllabi or someone else's, and to be able to see the ways in which their syllabus may not have these elements of these demystifying rules, for instance. Welcoming, validating, and so on. And what I'm showing on the other side, which you cannot see it, is a model syllabus from actually a faculty member, which is, if you can see, has a picture of bell hooks, and the way that it's written, the tone, everything is very different from many of the syllabi that we have seen. Most of the syllabi we see in community colleges, in particular, are very rules-oriented. They're also about pretty much the ways in which you can fail the course rather than succeed. And so what we have taught our math faculty in Colorado is to code their grade book. Instead of the names, what you will see there in the column that's 1, 2, 3 is actually the racial, ethnic identity of the students. And the coding is the coding of the students' success or not success in the first assignment, in the first exam, in the quizzes, in attendance. And in order for the faculty member to see the racialized patterns in their grade book. And this has also been a big aha for the faculty. Another one, competency is to self-monitor, right? But we cannot self-monitor ourselves. We cannot see ourselves in action. So we need to have, peers observe us. So in Colorado, we have taught the math faculty to observe each other. And here, but from an equity perspective, so here you have a faculty member describing what she saw in Tim's class. And what she saw, she counted. She counted how many times students spoke by race and ethnicity. And she said the white male students spoke 10 times. And the one Latino in the class, there were several Latinos, one who actually she knew from the math center spoke only 4 times, even though she knew that he was, knowledgeable. So this faculty member realized in his reflections that he was allowing this white voice to become the representation of the entire class. I want to go to this. So you all remember, well, not you, many of you don't remember because you're too young, the culture of poverty. So in the culture of poverty, Senator Patrick Moynihan, who was also a sociologist, Oscar Lewis, and I'm blanking out on the third person's name. It will come to me. They were the architects for how to fix the culture of poverty, and they created all kinds of programs. But they also did not see whiteness, and so everything that they did was directed at fixing minoritized populations. So that was in the 60s. My point here is that I'm afraid that many of the reforms that are being created in higher education, that the same thing is happening. Maybe it's not the culture of poverty, but there are many similarities. Because as I showed you, the pictures at the very beginning is about fixing these students without considering how the structures, the system itself, is not affirming, it is not welcoming to these students. So that's one point I want to make. The other point I want to make is based on this quote from Martin Luther King. He said, "Rarely do we find men who willingly engage in hard, solid thinking. There's almost a universal quest for easy answers and half-baked solutions. Nothing pains some people more than having to think." And so what I rewrote that, and I said, rarely do we find institutional stakeholders who willingly engage in hard, solid thinking about their practices and how they contribute to racist outcomes. There is an almost universal quest for structural solutions that leave whiteness untouched. So the point also is that racial equity is not a technical problem. It's a value problem, but we're trying to fix it with technical solutions. And then to end is a quote from Douglas Massey: "Papering over the issue of race makes for bad social theory, bad research, and bad public policy." And thank you very much, and I will stop here.